All right. Well, thank you so much, Trey. Thank you for this time. If you can just share a little bit of your work before we start a conversation on the book, just a little bit of who you are and a little bit of your work, and then we'll start with more specific questions on the book.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Josué, for this opportunity to be in conversation with you. I'm a big fan of the important work you're doing at with the Black Lives and Contemplation class and other important work you're doing with AfroLatine Diet. Yeah, in terms of my background, I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. Went to school in Illinois, and then came out to California a little over 15 years ago. I started serving in pastoral ministry at a local church. And through my studies, I became more interested in, through my ministry, I became more interested in the intersection of spirituality, preaching, and Black church studies. He eventually began to do some more graduate work in the area of theology and ultimately spirituality and preaching. And I currently serve as a professor, assistant professor at Fuller Seminary in the area of preaching and spiritual formation. And then also just started as our dean of chapel there. So a lot of my work is at the intersection of preaching and Christian spirituality with a particular interest in various Black traditions.
Great. Thank you. And on that, one of the things that I learned, I mean, learning about this from you, but as you know, as we've connected, is that you definitely had a conviction for contemplation, right? Like I'm going to use the word conviction, and like it felt something that you were, and even in your book, you said that you identified as that when you were like there was no word for it, or I don't think you said there was no word for it, but that when you found contemplative preacher or contemplative ideals, let's say, or ideas, that it became something that you felt that that's where you gravitated towards. So, what, considering that, obviously, what inspired you to write this book? I like I, as I said, I'm only saying it for the recording, obviously, but I think that the book is groundbreaking in what it's talking about, in the way that it's talking about Black contemplative preaching, and also just establishing a Black contemplative tradition, which I think is really important and salient for us as people of African descent in the diaspora and in the United States. Like, I just think that's really important. So, what inspired you to write this book? When did the idea first take shape? And what made you decide that this is what I want to share? This
Yeah.
this thing on Black contemplative preaching. I really want to share this.
Yeah, good question. Good question. Well, I've always had these contemplative inclinations. However, I didn't always feel emboldened or free to embrace them unapologetically. And then one of the critical moments of me more fully exploring what it means to live into these contemplative longings, desires that were brooding in me as an African American male was really encountering Howard Thurman. I have this friend, Justin West, who also writes on Thurman. He would talk about Thurman in our conversations, and I had no idea, who Howard Thurman was. He would go on and on about Thurman, and eventually, I was like, okay, I should check out Thurman. And it was while I was in seminary, I decided to write a paper on Thurman for a class on spirituality, and that really began to plant some seeds in my life and exploring the wisdom of Black contemplative spirituality for my life and for my ministry. Eventually, I encountered the extraordinary, groundbreaking work of Dr. Barbara Holmes, and after pastoring at a local church, I ended up transitioning into a doctoral program. Since I called to some academic ministry, and while I was in that program, I was looking for a dissertation topic and looking particularly for a way to bring together my interest in preaching, contemplative spirituality, and Black church studies, and landed upon this thing called contemplative preaching and a anthology on African American preaching that Dr. Martha Simmons and Dr. Frank Thomas put together called Preaching with Sacred Fire. And it was about a couple pages on contemplative preaching, and it really intrigued me and made me raise a lot of questions and begin to think about my own practice of preaching and ministry, and decided to choose that as the topic of my dissertation. And so the book is really a revision of that dissertation that I was excited to work on. I learned so much through building on the labor of others, and I was grateful for the chance to see it be published recently.
And I think that I'm glad that that's what you did. I mean, I'm thankful. You know how you know how God works, how the divine works, that things happen all at a time, and it feels very apropos that I remember when I discovered Barbara Holmes' work. Obviously, I've known of Howard Thurman's work, and it just seems like it was like, bubbling up, like, oh, Barbara Holmes, this connection, this, then meeting you, hearing of the Black Contemplative Society, thinking of the BLC thing, and then boom, here's this book. And then now there's these prayer retreats, and I'm like, oh, it's all it's like a thread. So I think that's really good. Let me ask you, this wasn't a question, but knowing that you leaned into contemplative, let's call it practice, how do you define contemplation for yourself? Knowing especially that that's such a, it's a term that can be defined different ways. There's some narrow definitions. As you know, I use a broad definition. But how do you define contemplation and contemplative practice for yourself?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean, yeah, there's a range of ways it's described. People like Saint John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, they would have a more perception of contemplation as more of a passive, something that we actually enter into. Is different from discursive meditation. Whereas Saint Ignatius and others would have a more active place for meditation and contemplation. I think for me, just at a simple level, I would think of contemplation as a practice of attending to the divine, in and through all things. And so, in that sense, it is fairly expansive and inclusive of different ways in which we might attune ourselves to God and the presence of God. I'm drawing obviously on Barbara Holmes, her work that talks about being attentive to the spirit of the living God as kind of a core dimension of contemplation. Cole Arthur Riley also talks about kind of sacred beholding or sacred attentiveness as the core of contemplation. So I do operate with more of a expansive, a kind of centered set definition of contemplation rather than more of a bounded description that tries to delineate who's in or who's out in the genuine, contemplation club.
Yeah, because I think that excluding that is what people do sometimes. They're like, oh, well, X person shouldn't be labeled a contemplative because they were not as spiritual or as religious as we wanted. But see, having said that, in your definition of contemplation, I really enjoy, I mean, I enjoyed the entire book. I really enjoyed the first chapter, preaching as prayer, because I felt like you traced it from, you trace contemplative preaching and contemplation, I would say overall, but contemplative preaching specifically. And you trace this lineage of Black contemplative preaching that started from, I want to say it was Ignatius. Now I'm forgetting the saint.
Augustine was the first person.
Augustine, that's right. And from Northern Africa, that's right. It was from, I always think of, was it that the second Ignatius or the first Ignatius? That's why I think I forgot. But you trace it from beginning from the continent, right? From Northern Africa into how that lineage plays itself out in the United States. And I would say that in the last chapter, you kind of go in this way that it goes back towards the rest of the diaspora. But I thought that chapter was really incredible. I thought the lineage that you trace and some of the people, I highlighted a lot of your footnotes in addition to the text, because some of the research notes I was like, oh, I didn't even know about this book, or I didn't even know about this person. So tell me, what was your research process? And yeah, what was insightful for you as you were like discovering things? Because for me, reading that chapter, I reread that chapter probably twice because I was like, oh man, I didn't even know this person. And I added a bunch of things to my cart of books that eventually to get. So how did you, so first of all, yeah, what was that process like? Like what, I'm sure there was intentionality. There was clear intentionality to trace it back to the continent, but how else, what did you discover during the research?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's surprising and humbling that someone would take the time to actually read something that I've written. So thank you for engaging the work. Yeah, so I love learning about women and men and others in the history of Christian spirituality. And this chapter was really, really my attempt to explore some of the threads of contemplation and contemplative preaching throughout the history of the church. Obviously, there's a lot written on contemplation and the history of the church. This was a chapter that emerged in some of my dissertation work where And the dissertation actually had more focus on kind of the Africana history of contemplative practice and contemplative preaching in particular. Had to remove some of that for the book to make it more streamlined. But yeah, I was building on the work of others as I engaged different scholarship on the history of Christian spirituality, and I was looking for signs of proclamation, kind of working with an expansive understanding of Christian preaching, particularly people who may have engaged in proclamation outside of a traditional kind of liturgical setting, even. And how might that in their life be seen as contemplative in the ways in which they attended to God and the Spirit of the living God in their life, in their ministry, in their proclamation? So, in doing that, I drew attention, as you mentioned, to Augustine, Kemper and other kind of, I think, 17th century African prophet who I stumbled upon by reading a book on the history of Christian missions, actually. And actually, it was a history of world Christianity, and I'd never heard of her. And so I think it was Dale Irvin and Scott Sunquist wrote this book on the history of world Christianity, and one of their volumes mentioned her briefly, and I began to do some more study and thought, wow, like this would be an interesting person to engage with as a kind of contemplative prophet or mystical prophet. Some others that I found in my research that I wasn't aware of were Rebecca Cox Jackson, who was a Black Quaker, a Black Shaker actually, who was a prophetess, a preacher, and visionary, who isn't often registered or showing up in literature on Black contemplation or Christian preaching in general. So yeah, it was fun to find these figures, these exemplars of, I would say, contemplative practice, who show that there is this lineage of people of African descent engaging not only in contemplation, but also a kind of contemplative proclamation. And then obviously I was highlighting some figures who are more well known in the history of the Black church and kind of offering a rereading of some of them as contemplative preachers, Jarena Lee being one of those, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who is former president of Howard University, Richard Allen, obviously the founder of AME Church. Some of these figures who show up in the histories of Black church literature, but not often as contemplatives. And I should also note that I'm building on the work also of Joy Bostic, her book African American Female Mysticism, which looks at Sojourner Truth, Jarena Lee, and I think it might be Rebecca Cox Jackson as African American female mystic activists. And so I build on her work and begin to look at some of those figures as mystical preachers, if you will.
Yeah, no, I thought that was really interesting. And I think the Kempavita story, I remember reading it, I thought it was actually not only important, but also decenters a male ownership of contemplation, which tends to happen. And I thought that's one of the reasons why I thought your book was really good, because you intentionally highlighted a lot of women. And I felt that in there. I was like, oh, because you could easily just go, let's just highlight the guys. That's what's easier to find, probably in the historical record. I was that engaged in the research that you did, but I thought her story was incredible. I thought Rebecca Clark Jackson, the Shaker, I thought that was incredible, because I think when you read Quaker Shaker stuff, you sometimes don't read about women at all, even in, let's say, white spaces or Black understandings. So I thought that was good. You talked that you feature some popular people, so this is good to ask about Howard Thurman. It's not that I don't want to talk about Howard Thurman. I think sometimes people think, I just always tell people there are more people than Howard Thurman. Like Howard Thurman is, yes, the top. And I'm like, and I've been impacted and continue to be impacted by Howard Thurman's writing and preaching all of the time. And I actually think there's something unique about his spirituality that I think you could call like a Thurman spirituality. I was telling that to someone. I'm like, just like we call it our Benedictine tradition. I'm like, there's a Thurman tradition that's explicitly unique, that a lot of people adhere to, that I think that's, King and others started to adhere to, that, yeah, did he create a rule of what his spirituality is? No. But I think, like I told someone, I'm like, I think there's a Thurman tradition that's really unique, that just like we talk about it. So anyway, my thing, because people say, well, why do you only always say there's more than Thurman? I'm like, because there's more than Thurman. But you always have to encounter Thurman. You have to encounter Thurman. Thurman is really important for just Black life overall, I think. And so how did you were obviously you're going to feature something on Thurman, but you specifically focus on his preaching, which I think is interesting because I don't think I'd read obviously I assign one of his sermons, two of his sermons in the class, like, and I always say you can read the sermon or you can listen to the sermon, which, I believe in this idea that the sermon is most actually proclaimed once you engage it. Once you read it, you're missing the contextual situation that happened with the congregation at that moment. And I had that, for example, this past Easter, I preached a sermon and someone read it and was like, well, your quote seems like, oh, is that your angle? I'm like, oh, you weren't there. And there's leading up to that sermon and what happened. And so I think there's that. So anyway, sorry for my little rant, but how would you qualify what is unique about Thurman as a contemplative preacher that you would highlight to someone, obviously, so that they can also purchase your book? But what would you say for this interview that you're like, this is something really unique about Thurman's preaching that I don't think we think about when we think about Thurman as a contemplative?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so let me maybe respond to it by thinking about, and this is, I love the question and I want to spend more time wrestling with it because I think it deserves some really deep and careful thought. But I would say Thurman holds together at least three dialectical tensions in his understanding of Christian contemplation that, at least to me, seem relatively unique. One is that for him, contemplation is the entry into contemplation is often active, but it also can be more passive. And so he emphasizes meditation as a kind of entryway into contemplation, obviously. But then he also has this robust understanding of suffering and the ways in which suffering can create openings and kind of strip away props that might lead us into a different kind of encounter with the divine in our life. In that sense, he has something like crisis contemplation, to use the language of Barbara Holmes, that appears in his work. But then a second kind of dialectical tension that I think we see in Thurman's understanding of contemplation is that it's both individual and communal. He has a strong focus on encouraging personal prayer and reflection and taking time for silence. But he's also, as a pastor, creating these communal environments for contemplation. And this is where he is uniquely engaging, I think, often preaching as a kind of opening for people to experience contemplation in community. And as part of that, he uses repetition, he uses silence, not as something that is empty, but is actually substantive. At one point, he says, God speaks loudest in silence. He invites his listeners to share in silence with him as a mode of attending to the presence of the divine. But then that third kind of dialectical tension, I think I'm curious about in Thurman's understanding of the contemplation is that it's not only, active and passive or individual and communal, but it's also a kind of contemplation that cultivates the inner life and it cultivates the outer life. And so he's very, very intentional in emphasizing interiority, right? Attending to our inward see, but he's also he also refuses for that to be untethered from action, from engagement with the world, and promoting God's shalom or God's justice in the places that are most in need. So this connection of contemplation to the inner and outer, shows up in his life and his meditations, but also in his preaching. As a pastor, he would talk about how he saw these corporate worship services as a kind of watering hole in which people would be renewed spiritually so that they could be sustained in their work in the world actively. So those are three tensions, so to speak, that I see in Thurman's life and his understanding of contemplation. And I think they also show up in his preaching.
So I agree. I actually love that you highlighted the fact that he's both individual and communal, because I do think that there are some mystics that do that. I think that a lot of mystics ask, right? I think there's only very few where like it's only you and God or only you and the divine. But I think that Thurman created pathways for his congregation. And I think I'm gonna, this is a language that I think you said. I think you say something like Thurman believes in the global call for contemplation, like everyone can be a contemplative or a mystic. I think you said that in a line in your chapter. I have the book right there. I was like, let me pull it out, but I don't need to. But I think you said something like that because I do think that is a unique quality of Thurman. Because Thurman, when he was creating, as you know, the text, the booklets for his church, right? It's for everyone. It wasn't like if you want to lean into contemplation, go here, and if you don't, then go over there. It was like everyone's going to do it. He built these breaks into his sermons, as you highlight in the book, that he purposely built pauses in his sermons to like receptive pauses.
Mhm.
Um, which I don't know if that's the language you use. I think that's the language that I interpreted is. But I remember reading that and I was like, yep, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that this universal call to contemplation that Thurman um, believes in, I think is really important.
Mm.
Let me ask you about Barbara Harris. So I didn't know much about Barbara Harris. I learned a lot I've heard her name through Episcopal circles. And I know she's an important figure in Episcopal spirituality and the US Black Episcopal, let's say Black non-AME Episcopal folks. Barbara Harris, but Barbara Harris is important overall. But I heard her name. I didn't know much about her. She's a really fascinating figure. You said something at the beginning of the book that she has this mystical hermeneutic. You said that you feel like that Barbara Harris has this mystical hermeneutic. Can you elaborate? I mean, you elaborate a little bit in your book, so people can read the book. But can you elaborate about what you mean by mystical approach to biblical interpretation, um, and how her because then you follow up with a chapter where you center mostly on women on the legacy of Black preaching, which I know is the next question. But can you just elaborate a little bit on the mystical hermeneutic, mystical approach to biblical interpretation, and how that maybe connects to the present day? I mean, she was pretty present. She just passed away a few years ago. May she rest in peace. But just wanted to know if there's something about it because I thought that was a very interesting that you said she carries this mystical hermeneutic.
Mm. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I privileged. I didn't know much about Bishop Barbara Harris until probably, definitely less than 10 years ago. And as I was looking at, wanting to focus on contemporary figure, I had a chance to learn that she was described as a contemplative preacher in the anthology Preaching with Sacred Fire. And she was still alive at that point. And so I reached out to her and was able to get in contact with her and spent some time talking with her and interviewing her. And my hope was to was to get the book out before she passed away, but she passed in the midst of the writing. So I hope I'm representing her, to the best of my ability. But yeah, I do describe her as well as some of the other figures, as embodying a kind of mystical hermeneutic. I talk about three distinctives of Black contemplative preaching. The habitus of prayer is one, the mystical hermeneutic is one, and then a meditative homiletical style is the another. But yeah, in terms of the mystical hermeneutic, I think about it as incorporating at least three different kind of distinctives. One is that it tends to focus on various scripture passages that emphasize God's character, God's presence in the Psalms and the Gospels. It's a strong focus on engaging with scripture as a resource to help people to encounter the living God in the present through proclamation. Then the second component is that not only does it draw on scripture, but it also draws on these alternative sources of wisdom, whether that be poetry, whether that be philosophy, whether that be hymns, whether that be ancestral wisdom in the sermon as a way to foster interiority and cultivate this contemplative way of being in the listeners. And hymns are a very prominent component of Bishop Barbara Harris's proclamation. She was known for including hymns in her preaching. And for her, in her memoir, she talks about hymns as a form of prayer, as other theologians have throughout the history of the church. And so these hymns being incorporated into her sermons are openings for the listeners to engage in kind of communal prayer in and through the sermon. And then the last component there in the mystical hermeneutic is that it tends to resist binary thinking, kind of either or dualistic thinking, and rather has a more holistic Africana approach to life in ways that invite people to experience oneness with the divine, with themselves, with others, and actually all creation. She once preached a sermon that really drew upon some of the African American hymnody. I think it was James Weldon Johnson, one of his hymns, with a kind of ecological approach in her sermon. So this hymn, this African American hymn, became a resource for a kind of ecological vision that promoted God's wholeness in the world today. So that kind of synthesis is something that is prominent in her preaching as she promoted justice for all people, including creation.
Yeah, no, I definitely learned a lot. I didn't know much about her until recently, and your book was the first time of me engaging in some of what she preached, and also her theory, like how you theorized that she spoke from where, what vantage point and what perspective did she speak? She spoke from, and I appreciate Barbara Harris's inclusion a lot for me. Um, and like I said, so in I feel there's a connection there between Barbara Harris, and then in the next chapter, in your final chapter, um, then talking about more current people who are preaching right now, who are active at the moment. I mean, you mentioned Amanda Gorman at the beginning and at the end of the book. You quote Colarto Raleigh to start that chapter, but there was a really interesting just line. It was one line. I said, "Blackness is not bounded." And I thought that was so profound because, as you know, the work that I do with Afro-Latinidad is also about, hey, do we understand the depth of Blackness and the profundity of Blackness and the expansiveness of Blackness? That's the kind of work that I think I'm trying to do with Blackness and contemplation. Like, do you understand that contemplation? It's also really Black, and it's also diverse in all these ways. And all of these people can also be thought contemplative. Tell me what you meant when you wrote that line, because it fits so well. Like, Blackness is not bounded. It fits so well with my frame of thinking. But I do also think of the way that all of these preachers, and obviously I didn't talk about MLK Jr. Again, it's not a thing. It's just, I'm like, well, okay, let's focus on what happens. They do have a broad view of Blackness. Like, I don't think any of the people you highlighted had a narrow definition of what Blackness was. They all have a broad view of Blackness, which I think contemplation engages you in, to make sure that you consider your experience in a broad perspective, right? And I said it one time somewhere, like a melanated cloud of witnesses. Like, that's what Blackness kind of allows you to do. So can you expand on what you mean by that in the context of understanding Blackness and contemplation? How is Blackness not bounded? What did you mean by that line? And what would you want us to extract from that line?
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm really impressed and inspired by the work you're doing, and I think you live this out, in a profound way that challenges me to press my own imagination towards a more expansive way of thinking about Blackness and contemplation. So, yeah, so that line for me, Blackness is not bounded. Just in a simple way, it's trying to gesture at the ways in which Blackness is not restricted to whatever static notions might be dominant in our imagination. And so, in the words of Ture, who once wrote a book, I think it was something like "Who's Afraid of Postmodern Blackness" or something like that. There's 1,000 ways, 1,001 ways to be Black, that there's not a singular way to talk about Black identity or Black culture or Black spirituality. J. Cameron Carter talks about how Blackness creates a non-exclusionary world. And so not only is Blackness internally diverse, but it actually promotes a kind of imagination that is always pressing the boundaries of belonging. There's this gravitational pull in Blackness towards a wider embrace, a more expansive embrace. And that's something that moves in and through Black contemplative preaching, as Black contemplative preachers are often people who are moving in multiple spaces. And so they often aren't restricted, let's say, to a traditional Black church. setting, but they might also be preaching in other ethnic communities. They might be preaching throughout the African diaspora, right? And so there is this sentiment or conviction, perhaps is better, for Black contemplative preachers to always be pulled towards living out, Thurman's dictum that all life is one. All life is one. So for me, that was part of what I was gesturing at and thinking about Blackness as not bounded. Blackness does not have a barbed wire fence around it, right? It's expansive, it's inclusive, and it's always running to expand our imagination of intimacy with the other, God, others, and also creation.
Well, I think that's wonderful. I actually forgot about that book by Torre. I remember seeing it, and in conversations about Blackness are obviously about the broad Blackness, right? There's specific experiences, like there's specific experiences of being a Black American, in the United States with that legacy versus a Black Colombian with that experience and that legacy, and versus someone in Senegal, right, with that experience and that. Like, there's always unique, but there is always, like Fanon says, right, the experience, the lived experience of the Black person is always the essence, or that whole debate about that word, essence or evidence or fact or whatever of Blackness, but it's just that is literally in the lived experience, and that lived experience could be millions of lived experiences, and therefore, but all of those are Black experiences, which I think is something really beautiful. What is one last thing that you want to leave us with, that you want to say about the book, about your process, and about what maybe you hope the book to do for anyone who's learning about contemplation? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was a privilege to be able to engage in this project. As I mentioned, I learned and drew upon the work with many others who I haven't named in this conversation: James Earl Massey, Danielle McCrae, and Andrew Prevost. Just a long list of folks who inspired and helped me in different ways in their writing in this project. But I would say one thing that I would hope is that the book does invite us into a more holistic and expansive imagination around contemplation, both in terms of engaging some figures, exemplars within Black church traditions that often aren't lifted up, but also as you talk about expanding the way we think about the practice of contemplation itself, as something that is beyond simply an individual practice, but also communal, as something that isn't simply interior, but also engaging exterior, active life, outer life. And then also something that is inviting us to a more robust understanding of belonging and human community. I wrote this book, during 2020, 2021. So it's all kinds of fragmentation and division and painful reminders of the persistence of racial injustice and more. And in the midst of that, I was really challenged to not talk about contemplation as neutral, but to really think about the ethical imperative that is always tethered to contemplation, at least Christian contemplation. Like, to actually contemplate God means that we are invited into a different way of being in the world that promotes God's shalom, God's flourishing for others. And so I hope that the book would invite people to learn more about different figures who are contemplatives, but also into a way of being in the world, so that a way of being in the world that unites contemplation with action, so that the love of God is more embodied in ways that promote God's justice.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Trey, and thank you for this gift. Thank you for this gift of this conversation, but also the gift of the book, because I do think that it helps, and that invitation that you said, right, to engage to engage in contemplative practices in a different way, or in a more, I know we keep saying the word expansive, but that just fits, right? I think that is something that the book offers, right? And I really think that, like, it just helped me think. Like, I think I consider myself a Black contemplative preacher after reading your book. I'm like, I think that kind of how I approach scripture, right? Because sometimes when I point something out, someone's like, "Oh, you read something differently in the text," and I'm like, "Oh, well, that's how I'm engaging with the text, right?" And I often think, like, and so I didn't have a language for it. I think you say this in the book, you're like, I didn't have a language for it. And I think that this is the way that I lean towards. And I remember pausing there. I remember exactly where I was in Brooklyn Botanical Garden, just reading outside. I was like, I think that I am a contemplative preacher too, because I engage in scripture in that way. I think there's such an engagement with the scripture in this, let's say, meditative way that then allows the proclamation of the text to come out a little differently. And I grew up in a Pentecostal setting, and I never felt like the shouting was what I would do. Like some people have that, which you talk about in the book. There are some people that's what they have, but that is not the only aspect of black preaching that exists. And I remember always feeling like, man, people like my sermons, but I can't deliver the bravado, that I just, that's not in me. I don't think that that's what I want to do. I want to make you think and pause, like, let's reflect on that thing. And reading your book, I think I said, I think I identify as a black contemplative preacher. So
Thanks
thank
for
you
your
for your book. Thank you.
thanks for this conversation. It was really an honor and privilege.